Good afternoon. In celebration and commemoration of Juneteenth, this presentation is about baseball, about American history, and also about the long and still ongoing process of desegregation in America. Quick note before beginning, occasionally I'm going to show some disturbing and offensive texts, graphic images, or photographs. I feel like they are all important to convey important messages, are part of our history, whether we like it or not, and that is why they're included. I'm going to start this presentation with 7 different quick introductions, each of which illustrates a point that I will expand on down the road. The first of these introductions is personal for me and pretty much explains how I got started with my interest in black baseball. Introduction number 1. This is what's called a rookie card, or a player's first baseball card, and in this case, for a guy named Pumpsie Green, who I'm assuming most, if not all of you, have never heard of. Pumpsie Green was the first African-American player with the Boston Red Sox. When he stepped onto the field on July 21st, 1959, the Red Sox were finally integrated, the last major league team to do so. Years later, when I was a teenager, I became aware of this fact, and it blew my mind. It blew my mind because I realized I was alive when baseball was segregated. In fact, the Athletics, the Cubs, the Pirates, the Cardinals, the Reds, the Senators, the Yankees, the Phillies, the Tigers, and Red Sox were all segregated teams when I was born. I get that I'm old, but this puts into perspective how recent the desegregation process in this country is. It had really just begun over a little more than a half century ago. This represents what I call the Major League time desegregation timeline. It identifies each player who was the first African American on each of the 16 teams during the 1940s and 1950s. Stop for a moment and think back to where you were 12 years ago. 12 years is an incredibly long time. It took a really, really long time after Jackie Robinson, the first black player in Major League Baseball, debuted with the Brooklyn Dodgers, for all the other teams to catch up. This is an article on the Hankyu Braves of the Japanese Pacific League from a Japanese baseball magazine from 1953. There are 2 African-American players who traveled to Japan to play on the Braves, Johnny Britton and Jimmy Newberry. Neither player could get a tryout with the major leagues, so they both packed up and traveled halfway around the world to play in Japan. This strikes me as being completely bizarre, not to mention really sad that the Japanese Pacific League included African-American players before 10 different American major league teams. Introduction number 2. The second introduction is also going to include a baseball card. This time, the back of the card where player statistics are shown. Baseball is a sport that is very much about statistics. Back in the 1980s, I spent a week vacation in the Chicago Public Library every day. I was a member of the Negro League Committee of the Society for American Baseball Research. We on the Negro League Committee were trying to right an historical wrong. You see all these statistics on the back of this Hank Aaron card? Well, they were meticulously kept for major league players, aka the white players, but none were kept by Major League Baseball for what were known as the Negro Leagues for black players. So we comb through microfilm of the sports pages of African-American papers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, looking for baseball box scores to painstakingly compile this data for all the players in the Negro Leagues. Introduction number 3. The Bing-Along Traveling All-Stars and Motor Kings is a 1970s movie about a barnstorming black baseball team in the late 1930s. It's actually a pretty good movie with a great cast, but it was Hollywood's version of events, completely watered down and whitewashed. The tagline at the bottom of the poster really says it all. Who would have thought it could be so much fun? Well, that Hollywood tagline is really implying, who would have thought racism and segregation could be so much fun? Because that is exactly what this movie is about. Well, this was the real face of racism in the US. This event, the 16th Street church bombing in Birmingham, more than any other event to me, represents the horror and reign of terror that was racism in America through much of the 20th century. On September 15, 1963, 4 African-American girls between the ages of 11 and 14 were blown up by 19 sticks of dynamite attached to a timing device beneath the steps of the church planted by a white supremacist terrorist group. Martin Luther King called this one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetuated against humanity. This is Sarah Jean Collins, who was blinded in the bombing. She was the lucky one in her family. Her sister, who was 14 and was standing next to her, was killed. This event brought much of America together and helped accelerate a long process of desegregation. Marches and protests and demonstrations that were taking place in the early 1960s helped, but the mass murder of children really galvanized American society in a way that nothing else did. Introduction number 4. The date on this Ebony magazine, featuring an article on Mary Tiller becoming the first African-American stewardess for TWA, caught my eye because it is the very same month that Pumpsie Green made his debut with the Red Sox, July 1959. And this is symbolic of an important link. Baseball took a dozen years to desegregate during the late 1940s and 1950s. It was a very, very public process. Once that process was complete, America was ready for a large-scale process of desegregation. Baseball made that process possible. This is Ruth Carroll Taylor, first African-American flight attendant for Mohawk Airlines. There's some question about who might be first, Tiller or Taylor. It really doesn't matter. They both were pioneers and both should be celebrated. What is important is that after baseball, there was an explosion of firsts. And let me quote from a 1997 interview for Jet magazine. Taylor said she didn't take the job because she thought the life of a flight attendant would be great. She said she did it to fight discrimination. And I quote, "It irked me that people were not allowing people of color to apply. Anything like that sets my teeth to grinding." Introduction number 5. This poster by the National Congress of American Indians is one of the most effective visual protest statements that I am aware of. It shows 3 different baseball caps representing 3 different baseball teams: the New York Jews, the San Francisco Chinamen, and the Cleveland Indians. Each cap includes an incredibly offensive racist caricature of the ethnic group represented by each team. But the crazy thing is that one of these teams is real. It took over 100 years to change the Chief Wahoo logo, an Indian's name, on the Cleveland cap. It was only a few years ago that the racist logo was phased out, and then shortly thereafter, the name was changed to the Guardians. 2021, incredible, because it is equally as offensive as the other 2 examples. But America has a history of acceptable racism and unacceptable racism, depending on the group and the time. Introduction number 6. So just about everyone knows that Jackie Robinson was the first Black American to break into baseball playing on white teams, except that is not entirely accurate. William Clarence Matthews, an African-American, played for Harvard at the turn of the century and led the team in batting every year he was there. He led Harvard to a record of 75 wins against only 18 losses, which is crazy good. After graduating in 1905, he joined a professional team in Burlington, Vermont, and at the time, he was the only African-American in the nation playing professional baseball in a predominantly white league. Unfortunately, despite his incredible hitting and fielding abilities, not to mention his Harvard pedigree, other teams in the Vermont League refused to play with him. Ignorance and hatred won out. Matthews went on to enroll at Boston University School of Law. He was admitted to the bar in 1908. He went on to become a U.S. Assistant Attorney General in the administration of President Calvin Coolidge. But again, it wasn't appropriate for him to play alongside white players in the Vermont League. And this is M.P. Robinson, who played ball with Oberlin College at about the same time, turn of the century. And that is absolutely everything I know about him. There are far too many people like William Clarence Matthews that we don't know enough about, and far too many people like M.P. Robinson that we know nothing about. These guys were trailblazing pioneers whose stories are buried in decaying newspapers and other fading documents hidden in library basements and attics. Their stories need to be fully researched and documented. And finally, introduction number 7. When eBay started up a few decades ago, this was one of the first things I picked up. I know absolutely nothing about this team, except this is a kids' ball team, and judging from the uniform, it has got to be one of the oldest photos in existence of an integrated baseball team. I love this photo because it is kids making up this integrated team, and kids, as always, represent innocence and the hope for a better future. I should add that most of my baseball collection from which these images come is made up of photos of integrated teams from before 1945, when Jackie Robinson signed on with the Montreal farm team for the Brooklyn Dodgers. I have done this to do by small part to preserve the history, showing that people at a grassroots level have been doing the right thing long before those in power were doing the right thing. Now on to finally the base of the presentation. I'm going to go through the quick history of baseball intertwined with a selective history of the United States. First, to quote Martin Luther King, "Segregation is the adultery of an illicit intercourse between injustice and immorality." This is a quarter-century timeline that intertwines baseball's beginnings with the tumultuous period in America, starting in 1845 with baseball's first published rules, followed by the last slave ship arriving in America, the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment, ending with the first real black and white baseball teams. This is a receipt from 1855, importantly contemporaneous with the beginning of baseball in this country, which is why I'm showing this. It is a receipt like any other receipt you might get, but this is a receipt for the sale of human beings. I am going to read it. This receipt is for $2,700 in full consideration for 4 Negroes. Margaret, aged about 28 years. Mike, aged nearly 10. Morton, aged 4 years, 4 months. David, aged 1 year and 8 months. The right and title of said Negroes I warrant and defend. This is one of the most chilling documents I have ever seen. No matter how many times I read this, it is as terrifying as the first time. Please remember these words when someone talks about the sanctity of the U.S. Constitution, because it took almost 100 years to address the situation of slavery after the signing of the Constitution. This context is important. In 1867, the Philadelphia Pythians, under the tutelage of civil rights pioneer Octavius Cotto, one of the earliest known African-American baseball teams, played its first full season. 2 years later, in 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, a white team, became the first openly salaried team and are thus considered the first professional baseball team. 1878, a few years later, this represents the Reconstruction period in the wake of the Civil War. Because African Americans in South Carolina vastly outnumbered whites, the newly enfranchised voters were able to send so many African American representatives to the state assembly that they outnumbered the whites. Many were legislators who worked to rewrite the state constitution and pass laws ensuring aid to public education and civil rights for all. This was a time of optimism and hope and the potential for a progressive future. 1884, This is a really, really early photograph of an integrated team from Schoharie, New York, and a perfect example of something with almost no information attached to it. Something that is an important part of an historical puzzle and needs research. A year later, this is the Argyle Hotel in Babylon, New York. The Argyle Hotel was the birthplace of the first salaried professional African-American baseball team established in 1885. The Cuban Giants, just a few years after the Cincinnati Red Stockings. It is important to note that there was no association with Cuba and there were no Cuban players. There are many theories about the name, but I believe this was a case of a team trying to pass, that is, slip by under the segregation radar. Many others disagree with this. Parenthetically, one fictional character in the Bingo Long movie we just discussed, Charlie Snow, was a player constantly scheming to break into segregated Major League Baseball of the 1930s by masquerading first as a Cuban, Carlos Nevada, and then a Native American, Chief Takahoma. This is also 1885. The guy in the middle is Bud Fowler, a name you should know. He was a baseball player, manager, and club organizer. He is generally regarded as the earliest known African-American player in organized professional baseball. He was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame just recently, 2022. Better late than never. Another really important name is Moses Fleetwood Walker, catcher for Oberlin College varsity team in 1881. That's a photo upper right. The varsity baseball team at the University of Michigan in 1882 and 1883, photo lower right. He signed with the Toledo Blue Stockings in 1884, and when Toledo joined the American Association, Moses Fleetwood Walker became the first African American in the major leagues, a milestone in American history that not enough people know about. Syracuse Stars in 1887. The team also included Moses Fleetwood Walker, catcher, and Robert Higgins, pitcher. And finally, Ulysses Frank Grant of the Buffalo Bisons, who is regarded by many historians as the greatest Black player of the 19th century. So I'm trying to show that during the 1880s, there was a fairly sizable push toward integration of white teams with many very talented and quite capable Black players. And then this guy came along. Cap Anson is one of the most distinguished members of the Baseball Hall of Fame. He batted over 300 for 20 consecutive seasons, which was unheard of. He had 1,719 runs batted in, and he was the first player to accumulate 3,000 hits. But also, he was a vicious racist who was in great part responsible for barring African Americans from professional baseball. He refused to take the field against Toledo's African American catcher, Moses Fleetwood Walker, who just looked at. And he again refused to take the field against Newark's Black pitcher, George Stovey, and was instrumental in creating the secret gentleman's agreement banning Black players that was in effect for the next 3/4 of a century. There'll be more about that coming up. And in his written memoir, he referred to Clarence Duval, the White Stockings mascot, the team he played for, who was African American, as a little darky, a coon, and a no-account N-word. Today, there are some of the greatest hitters of all time who are not in the Hall of Fame because of betting on sports or use of performance-enhancing drugs, PEDs. 4 of the greatest home run hitters, Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, and Rafael Palmeiro, are not in the Hall because of the use of steroids. What, I ask you, is the greater offense, drugs or being the catalyst for 60 years of a blatant racist color line? I'm not actually arguing that Cap Anson should be removed from the Hall of Fame, but he needs an asterisk, a significant explanation about his part in drawing the color line. Nothing of the sort exists. Moses Fleetwood Walker became so incredibly disillusioned with the plight of the Black man in America that he wrote Our Home Colony and I quote, a treatise on the past, present, and future of the Negro race in America. The quote in this slide, the Negro can never be raised to an equal point in civilization while occupying his isolated position in the United States, sums up Walker's feelings in one sentence. At the time, this was regarded by some as the most learned book a professional athlete ever wrote. Our home colony shared Walker's thesis on the victimization of African Americans and a proposal for African Americans to emigrate back to Africa. I think that this is incredibly depressing. Things for African Americans just got worse and worse before and after the century change. For those who don't know, Plessy v. Ferguson was a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision in which the court ruled that racial segregation laws did not violate the U.S. Constitution as long as the facilities for each race were separate, were equal in quality, a doctrine that came to be known as separate but equal. In other words, the highest court in the land ruled the existence of laws based upon race was not inherently racial discrimination. To me, if one is saying that one race is going to be treated separately from another race, that is the very definition of not equal. You can see that the institutionalized segregation in the U.S. at large started at exactly the same time as that in baseball, and one state after another fell in line for the next 20 years with these horrendous laws. Just a few years later, states started adopting plans that used literacy and understanding tests and poll taxes to disenfranchise Black Americans. This, by the way, is not all that different than what is happening today. A century and a quarter later, with gerrymandering of districts to dilute the Black vote and closing of polling places in predominantly Black areas to diminish the Black vote. I'm going to read this quote from David Lamy, actually a Black English politician. Let me speak frankly. Separate but equal is a fraud. It is the language that tried to push Rosa Parks to the back of the bus. It is the motif that determined that Black and white people could not possibly drink from the same water fountain, eat at the same table, or use the same toilets. So we're going to talk about some of these early teams. Here are some visuals. This is an example of history lost and fading. This is a cigar box top, and by the way, a beautiful piece of artwork depicting the Buxton Wonders, a team sponsored by the Consolidation Coal Company of Buxton, Iowa, during the first part of the last century. When the coal dried up, the town became a ghost town, and the team disappeared into history. They are just one of 1,000 teams not affiliated with the professional Negro leagues who barnstormed locally. And these are just a few of those 1,000 teams, just to give a visual. Not sure if everyone is familiar with the acronym HBCU, Historically Black Colleges and Universities. The first half of the last century is when many of these colleges and universities were formed, and virtually all of them had baseball teams and played each other. And by the way, there were 1,000 African American women's teams across the country. I'm out of the historical time frame here, but I wasn't sure where else to put this, and I wanted to include it. I'm including this photo because the military was segregated all the way up to what I'm going to call the Pumpsie Green moment in the 1950s, and because there were over 6,500 Black women in the Women's Army Corps in World War II. And a lot of these women were members of baseball teams like the team shown here while training before going overseas. Parenthetically, the Congressional Gold Medal was just awarded recently, yet again, better late than never, to the oldest 6 surviving members of one of these African American Women's Army Corps battalions that was stationed in Europe. Back to the original time frame for this section. Many workplaces, factories, distribution facilities, police organizations, companies of all kinds often had baseball teams that competed with other companies or in broader leagues. Here is one example, the Hyatt Roller Bearing Company. They made roller bearings from the last part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century before they were acquired by General Motors. This is their monthly company magazine that featured their baseball team on the cover of the September 1916 issue. Note that the team is all white. They are featured as champions of the Manufacturers Baseball League. But they also had a black team, the Hyatt Colored Giants. They did not get the same uniforms as the white team. This is the very last page of the company magazine. The Hyatt Colored Giants barely gets a footnote in the newsletter. This, as shameful as it was absolutely the norm for many, many companies in the US for the entire first half of the last century. So who did these teams play? Everybody. Here are some random schedules starting at the first part of the century. This one is for a Vermont private high school, white. Their schedule includes playing mostly other high schools, but also an alumni team and a couple colleges, and the Cuban Giants, who are an offshoot of the Cuban Giants, the first professional African-American team that we just looked at. This is the 1909 Athletic Club of Atlantic City, New Jersey baseball schedule. This includes 9 different games with 4 different African-American teams. This is the Chicago Intercity Baseball Park schedule for 1925. As an Evanston, Illinois resident, I'm proud to see that the schedule included 2 different teams, the Evanston Tigers and the Evanston Progressives. I'm not so proud to note that Evanston apparently segregated its baseball teams, and both the Tigers and Progressives were, as they put it, colored teams. This is the program for the Farmall Club Picnic of 1935 for Harvester Industrial Council, which became the huge conglomerate International Harvester. Farmall, by the way, was the tractor brand. It included a game between the company team and the St. Louis Colored Giants. And finally, the Athens, Maine Wessarusett Valley Fair of 1936. The fair included 2 days of games between the Philadelphia Colored Giants and the Boston Colored Royal Giants. This did not even involve a team from Maine. The Negro League. So what were the so-called Negro Leagues? A quote from the great pitcher Satchel Paige. Never let the odds keep you from pursuing what you know in your heart you are meant to do. When you hear the term Negro Leagues, it is not referring to all of the teams and organizations that African Americans use for baseball. There were specific leagues that fell into the Negro League category. There are 2 lists shown here. The first list was commonly thought of as the Negro Leagues and sometimes referred to as the major Negro Leagues. The second list in smaller font is a list of minor Negro Leagues. But you can see from this extensive list that the Negro Leagues were as huge to the Black community as the major leagues were to the white community. And also looking at this list, it is crazy to me that there was this huge parallel universe created for a segment of the US population who are not allowed to participate in what was a primary universe. It just boggles my mind. So originally with this presentation, I had slides for over a dozen of the major Negro League players in history. Because of time limitations, I've culled that down to just one slide. Satchel Paige is one of the great people in not just Negro League history, not just great in baseball history, but to me, great in American history. He played for an astounding 22 different teams, had the most Negro League victories and lowest earned run average multiple times, and notably 78,383 people came out for his first major league appearance when he jumped from the Negro Leagues to the Cleveland Indians. He was an astounding 42 years old at the time. And by the way, he set a record that still stands today when he was a rookie at 42 years of age, which is almost beyond belief. On to a segment I call protest. Activism is my rent for living on the planet, a great quote from the great American novelist, short story writer, poet, and social activist Alice Walker. To be clear, from the moment the color line was drawn in 1886, barring African Americans from playing in organized baseball, there were clear and articulate voices of protest. I'm going to give a couple examples from the very beginning, 1886, and immediately after. First, here is a quote from a published letter by Weldie Walker, who's the brother of Moses Fleetwood Walker, to the president of the Tri-State League. It ends with these words: "There should be some broader cause, such as a lack of ability, behavior, and intelligence, for barring a player rather than his color. It is for these reasons, and because I think ability and intelligence should be recognized first and last at all times and by everyone, I ask the question again, why was the law permitting colored men to sign repealed?" Again, this is 1886. Another example from a couple years later, 1907. Saul White, captain of the Philadelphia Giants, a team with the first organized Black professional league of the 20th century, the National Association of Colored Baseball Clubs of the United States and Cuba. In this official baseball guide published in 1907, he noted, and I quote, "All the leagues during the winter of 1887 and 88 drew the color line or had a clause inserted in their constitutions limiting the number of colored players to be employed by each club. This color line had been agitated by A.C. Anson, who we just talked about, captain of the Chicago national team, for years. The cause of this change is no doubt due to the condition of things from a racial standpoint." Now I'm jumping forward in time to just before the color line was broken. So I've gotten a lot of random things on eBay, and this is definitely one of those. This is a petition from the New York State Teenage Division of the American Youth for Democracy, and it is to the New York Giants, New York Yankees, and Brooklyn Dodgers. The petition ends with these words: "We, the undersigned, therefore urge you take immediate action to correct this un-American discrimination by giving a fair tryout to Negro players and by signing up those who qualify." Now I'm going to jump forward in time to after the color line had been broken to give some examples of how African-American athletes, primarily Jackie Robinson, played pivotal roles with battling segregation in America. This is the first of 3 press photos from May of 1963 that document a single week of protest planning for Birmingham, Alabama. Once again, thank you, eBay. In this slide, Jackie Robinson has just had a knee operation and is hobbling on a cane and is going to Birmingham to march. Seriously, who does this kind of thing ever? Not to mention after a knee operation. One day later, on May 9, former Brooklyn Dodgers baseball star Jackie Robinson and former heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson joined hands in double handshake after Patterson said he would go to Birmingham, Alabama with Robinson May 13 to join anti-segregation marchers. Patterson, who will go south with a bandaged hand following a knuckle operation, says he intends to be nonviolent, but he says, "I will protect myself against police dogs." And then a couple days later on May 14, and this is the caption, quote, "Two of the sporting world's greats visited Birmingham late May 13th to help Dr. Martin Luther King in his efforts to settle unrest in Birmingham. Floyd Patterson, former heavyweight champ, and Jackie Robinson, former Dodgers baseball player, joined ministers Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King at a rally in a local Negro church." Jumping forward into the 1960s, finally the message is being pushed out and to kids. The Associated Negro Press was constantly, for decades, providing blistering editorials regarding racism in the military and in baseball, and in this case, linking the two. And I quote, Nothing came as close to illustrating the absurdity of the color barrier like World War II. During the war, more than 50 Negro League players served their country in the armed forces. And they seem to want our boys for the wearing worries of war, but they don't want them sharing the more peaceful pursuits of Major League Baseball. And by the way, the photos of the Harlem Hellfighters, a highly decorated black infantry unit made up of New Yorkers who received a Congressional Gold Medal for their fierce fighting in Europe. I have to mention Benjamin Davis, who was an African-American lawyer and who was elected in 1943 to the New York City Council representing Harlem. He'd earned an undergraduate degree from Amherst and a law degree from Harvard in the 1930s, which was still pretty much unheard of for Black Americans. I think he was the major politician who never gave up hammering on the issue of segregation in the major leagues. In the article on the right titled Davis Seeks Inquiry in Baseball Race Bias, Davis called on the New York State Commission on Discrimination to, and I quote, investigate the question of racial discrimination in professional baseball and to bring about a discontinuance of such practices. New York State at the time had laws barring discrimination in employment in the state, but this, like every other action over the last half century at the time, had one roadblock after another thrown up to stop it. As an aside, I should mention that Harlem was broken up into 3 districts in an effort to dilute the Black vote, taking away Davis's voter base. And in July 1948, Davis, who was a self-described communist, was charged with conspiring to overthrow the federal government under the Smith Act. This was during the McCarthy Red Scare era. Davis went to prison for 3 years for essentially protesting discrimination. When he was released, 10,000 of his supporters from Harlem turned out to welcome him home. So this segment is titled Beyond the Major Leagues and the Gentleman's Agreement. You must not lose faith in humanity. Humanity is an ocean. If a few drops of the ocean are dirty, the ocean does not become dirty. Mahatma Gandhi. The point here is that we have to look beyond the power structures of Major League Baseball and the team corporations, instead to community organizations and grassroots organizations and schools, many of whom had no issue with fielding one integrated team after another. These are just 2 collages of the thousands and thousands of teams that did things right, ignoring the concept of segregation. Now to address the change in baseball, and I know I'm jumping around in time to illustrate different aspects and different issues. Bear with me. Bureaucracy defends the status quo long past the time when the quo has lost its status. Here are 3 of the many, many official documents from various branches of the armed service that have been declassified or unclassified and made available by the Freedom of Information Act. Remember, these are reports coming from the highest levels of the armed forces of the U.S. government. I could provide pages and pages of outrageous quotes regarding desegregating the military, but here are 3. Sorry again. If the issue were forced, there will be a lowering of contentment, discipline, and teamwork in the service. Officers in general will not recommend Negroes for promotion to positions of authority over white men. The assumption of the Army Air Forces seems to be that Negroes cannot be developed into Army pilots. Most Negroes had been employed in service functions because they had generally been regarded as unsuitable for combat. This is background context, official U.S. government documentation. This is to give some context for the general positions of the U.S. government, literally just as baseball is about to begin the process of desegregation. In my opinion, it should not have been baseball to lead the way, but the U.S. government. But given the way things unfolded, I think we were much better having the national pastime do it. In 1942, a few years before the Jackie Robinson signing, there were a considerable number of players supportive of desegregation. Same for the managers in baseball. The owners comment, and I quote, "We have always been interested in Negro players, but have not used them because of the public," unquote, taking no responsibility for their own actions and lying constantly for decades. This is the group that was ultimately responsible for perpetuating the multi-decade debacle dubbed the Gentleman's Agreement. In other words, nothing in writing, barring African Americans from the national pastime, the Major League Baseball Rules Committee. Quote from the commissioner, "There is no rule against Major League clubs hiring Negro baseball players. Negroes are not barred from organized baseball by the commissioner and never have been during the 21 years I have served. There is no rule in organized baseball prohibiting their participation and never has been, to my knowledge," unquote. This reeks of disingenuousness. Here is a headline from a couple years ago and another headline for a couple months later. Justice eventually prevails. Now for something completely different. I've collected baseball cards for almost my entire life, and I feel like there is an enormous amount of not only baseball history, but American history printed on these cards, so we're going to take a couple-minute trip down this road. These are a couple examples of baseball cards from the first half of the last century. These are cards produced representing major league players, beautiful and artistic. And there have been women represented on baseball cards. These cards go back to the very year that the color line got drawn in baseball in 1887. The Page Fence Giants were a phenomenal professional Black American baseball team in Adrian, Michigan from 1895 to 1898, performing as one of the nation's top teams in the Black Leagues. Named after the Page Woven Wire Fence Company in Adrian, they were sponsored by the founder, J. Wallace Page. This is from the 19th century, and I believe there are less than 10 left in existence. After this, essentially, there was a 50-year drought in the production of cards with African American players. And this is a collection of American baseball cards portraying African Americans covering the first half of the last century. Not a card was produced in America during the entire tenure of the Negro Leagues representing an African American player the way every white major league player was represented year after year after year. Instead, America produced this. I seriously struggle to make sense of this, and I cannot wrap my head around the fact that white America thought decade after decade that this unbelievably offensive material was acceptable to produce and distribute. These are Black players from the Negro Leagues in the U.S. who, to supplement their incomes, played Winter League baseball in Cuba after the normal Summer League in the U.S. So the Cubans had baseball cards. The Cubans did what America did not, created baseball cards of American players for the Negro League teams. Ditto, Puerto Rico. They also had a Winter League and represented in these Puerto Rican cards are Negro League players, future Major League players, and again, future Hall of Famers. Remember Jimmy Newberry and Johnny Britton from the Hankyu Braves from one of the introductory segments? Well, I got these Yamakatsu cards from Japan. Again, thank you, eBay. Even the Japanese had cards of African American players. We have Cuban cards, Puerto Rican cards, and Japanese cards of black players. And we have the offensive garbage produced by Americans that I showed you a couple slides back. This is really shameful. In my opinion, this baseball card is the holy grail of all baseball cards. First of all, Josh Gibson, who probably most of you have never heard of, may have been the greatest hitter who ever lived. Thanks to the color line, we will never really know. His baseball statistics blow away any other player, and he did all of that before the age of 35 when he died of a stroke. This is his card from the Toletero Card Company from Puerto Rico. It was actually made in 1951, a couple years after he passed away, and is extremely rare. The last auction sale of this card that I'm aware of was a couple years ago, and it was for a card in poor condition. It sold for $106,000. Someday, one in good condition will surface, and it will sell for $1 million. Jackie Robinson, who we've already touched on. Quote, "The right of every American to first-class citizenship is the most important issue of our time." Jackie Robinson. And I want to let that second quote resonate for a minute. Jackie Robinson made my success possible. Without him, I would never have been able to do what I did. Martin Luther King stated over and over that he could never have accomplished what he did without the groundwork that Jackie Robinson laid for him. Jackie Robinson was simply one of the most important people in American history. He became an international star and an ambassador who embodied all that was good with America. Jackie Robinson's signing with the Montreal Club of the International League, the minor league club affiliated with the Brooklyn Dodgers, was a moment that people had been waiting for 3/4 of a century. October 23rd, 1945. Robinson could not have been a more perfect person to fill this role. He was a graduate of UCLA, where he was the first athlete to win varsity letters in 4 different sports: baseball, basketball, football, and track. He was an all-around phenomenal athlete. He was then with the Army in a segregated unit during World War II, but his military career got derailed when he was ordered to the back of a bus by a racist driver, and he refused. It set off a whole stream of absurd racist events, including his being threatened with court-martial, all over his refusing to move to the back of the bus. God bless him. With a stroke of a pen in 1945, he began to crack a wall that had been holding back Black Americans for a couple of centuries. This is a photo of the crowd that came out on May 18th, 1947, to watch Jackie Robinson play in Chicago with the Brooklyn Dodgers for the very first time. The game drew a paid crowd of 46,572 fans. The total crowd was over 47,000 people. These numbers are astounding and stand as records for Wrigley Field even today, over the last 3/4 of a century, a testament to both how incredibly popular Jackie Robinson was and a recognition of what an amazing moment in history this event was. This headline says it all and is simply the best. Kids countermand Ku Kluxers. I can't begin to tell you how important it was for Americans to see photos like this day after day. This, by the way, was taken in Georgia, the South. Now, some correspondence with U.S. presidents by Jackie Robinson. 1957 telegram to the White House. Am opposed to the Civil Rights Bill in its present form. Have been in touch with a number of my friends. We disagree that a half loaf is better than one. Have waited this long for bill with meaning, can wait a little longer. Unless House amends bill, hope the president will veto it. We sincerely appreciate the many true Americans who insist on equal rights for all. 1958. My dear Mr. President, I respectfully remind you, sir, that we have been the most patient people of all. When you said we must have self-respect, I wondered how we could have self-respect and remain patient considering the treatment accorded us throughout the years. 17 million Negroes cannot do as you suggest and wait for the hearts of men to change. We want to enjoy now the rights that we feel we are entitled to as Americans. This we cannot do unless we pursue aggressively goals that Americans achieved over 150 years ago. And again, 1967 to Lyndon Johnson. Dear Mr. President, sir, let me thank you for your domestic stand on civil rights. We need an even firmer stand as the issues become more personal and the gap between Black and white Americans get wider. I find all this correspondence amazing. I don't think any other sports figure has done anything like this since Robinson. A 1949 press photo noting that Robinson was going to testify before Joe McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee on the loyalty of African Americans. And this is the speech Robinson gave to the House Un-American Activities Committee. He spoke a lot about politics in the speech, but I'm going to read a few sentences that showed his self-awareness. You can put me down as being an expert as a colored American with 30 years at it. And just like any other colored person with sense enough to look around him and understand what he sees, I know that life in these United States can be mighty tough for people who are a little different from the majority in their skin color or the way they worship their God or the way they spell their names. I am not fooled because I've had a chance open to very few Negro Americans. It's true that I've been the laboratory specimen in a great change in organized baseball. I am proud that I have made good on my assignment to the point where other colored players will find it easier to enter the game and go to the top. But I'm very well aware that this limited job is not yet finished. This document with Jackie Robinson's last-minute pencil markings hangs on the wall in my home office. Because Robinson was receiving constant hate mail and death threats, the FBI was brought in to investigate these instances and to provide protection for him. This is part one of Jackie Robinson's FBI file. Here's part two. On the other hand, freedom of information explorations have determined that the FBI, shockingly, was interested in Robinson for very different reasons. Investigation of his civil rights work, monitoring of his speaking engagements, monitoring of his writing, monitoring of his correspondence. Essentially, the FBI was spying on him for years. A couple of years ago, when LeBron James, arguably the second best basketball player of all time, spoke out about police brutality against Black citizens, a Fox News host said on her nightly news show that he should, and I quote, shut up and dribble. But Jackie Robinson got it from both sides, which was tough. He got huge criticism from the segregationists, but he also got criticism from the Black community, who was afraid he was making too many waves and that there would be retribution. Doing the right thing is sometimes a lonely act. How the subculture of Black businesses dealt with segregation. If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Shirley Chisholm, the brilliant congressperson. This is a travel guide published by the Afro-American newspapers, which covered the Midwest, the entire Eastern Seaboard, and the Gulf. It identified hotels and guest houses throughout the entire region so that a group of people completely shut out of mainstream society at large could continue to go about their daily lives and simply travel like the rest of society. And here you have postcards advertising Negro homes and colored motels. I simply cannot repeat enough how incredibly appalling it is that American society forced the invention of an entire subculture so that African Americans could exist in an America that did not allow them to coexist with the rest of America. And please remember this next time you hear a politician or pundit insisting that there has been no inherent structural racism guiding the historical development of the U.S. And of course, same with baseball for 3/4 of a century. The headline here, "Will the big leagues kill Negro baseball?" from Color Magazine of 1948. At the time of this publication, there were only 3 African Americans in the major leagues, but the handwriting was already on the wall. The Negro leagues, which were born of necessity, were now in jeopardy. So I'm going to end this section with this juxtaposition of a team photo and a bus crash photo, each from 1953. First, the Kansas City Marks, world colored baseball champions, one of the real premier teams in all of baseball, white or black, a team symbolizing royalty in baseball with a regal name. Around for 46 years with 14 Hall of Fame members, including Jackie Robinson, Satchel Paige, and probably the most revered Chicago Cubs player of all time, Ernie Banks. Next, a photo of their team bus, crashed and burning. And as the caption says, voice overheard on the police radio by Buck O'Neill, the Kansas City manager, who was one of those in the Hall of Fame at the scene of the team bus crash. And I quote, "Don't worry, it's just some N-words broke down." Incredibly ironic and at the same time incredibly sad. To me, this represents the end of organized black baseball. I call this the opening of the floodgates after Jackie Robinson was signed. And a quote from Michelle Obama, "History has shown us that courage is contagious and hope can take on a life of its own." Fans lined up to do all-star voting for the new group of African-American players. This is Larry Doby, hot on the heels of Jackie Robinson signing with the National League team. Larry Doby signed up with the American League. This press photo was apparently rushed out so quickly because this was huge news that they got the wrong Ohio team, Cincinnati instead of Cleveland. After retirement, Doby went on to serve as the second black manager in the major leagues. I'll get to the first momentarily. With the Chicago White Sox, and in 1995 was appointed to a position in the American League's executive office. Larry Doby, once again. Let me jump into a detail here, a quote from this press photo. Chicago outfielder Larry Doby wears protective headgear. The headgear resembles a football helmet with top section removed and affords protection from pitch balls that go astray. Pitch balls were not going astray. Pitchers were literally throwing at Doby's head. He created this helmet for self-preservation. And while we were on the subject, Jackie Robinson was constantly getting impaled by the spikes from shoes from players sliding into second base with feet high. This whole group of early black ball players had to have constitutions of steel, coming to work each day and being subjected to not only heckles and jeers and racist slurs and being spit on, but also being subjected to physical violence. This collection of experiences seems absolutely unimaginable to me today. Continuing the same thread, this is Dan Bankhead, who a month after Larry Doby joined the major leagues, joined up as the first African-American pitcher in the major leagues. Continuing in the same thread, this is Eddie Andrews. He actually never made it out of the minor leagues, never pitching for a major league team, but it was news when a black player even worked out with the team. So like an interview with the team was big news. This is the guy who actually was the first pitcher for the Yankees, Alphonse Downing, or Al Downing as he came to be called, because after all, whoever heard of a baseball player named Alphonse? This was literally 7 years after Eddie Andrews got his tryout to be a Yankee pitcher. This is how slowly the segregation wall took to be torn down. Roy White was one of the most beloved Yankees ever, who, when he retired, set up the Roy White Foundation, a charity aimed to help children and young adults in the New York area who'd like to attend college but did not have the financial resources to do so. When he joined the Yankees AA farm team, the Columbus Confederate Yankees, during the mid-1960s, he was given a uniform that included a patch of the Confederate flag. White commented that the patch did not bother him. What bothered him was contending with constant overt racism. Now on to the 1960s, a decade of change. So I've already laid the groundwork to show that the process of desegregation, at least the first part, ended with Pumpsie Green in 1959, and that desegregation in America in general started at about the same time. I have two quotes, one from Dr. King and one from Malcolm X, both saying the same thing in different ways, reflecting two different approaches. Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom. A man can't ride you unless your back is bent. And nobody can give you freedom. Nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it. I feel like the 1960s was a decade of enormous change, and that is what I want to show in the next few minutes. To set up the discussion of the 1960s, I'm going to show three different versions of essentially the same press photo, only with different African-American players in each. The first is from the 40s, with Jackie Robinson and his family. Note the headline, Triumph Over Prejudice. Same type of family photo, this one from the 1950s, next decade, this time with the great Roy Campanella. New decade, and we've moved beyond a discussion of race, just family. And finally, the 1960s, this time with the great Yankee Yelston Howard, who we just named MVP, Most Valuable Player. The only difference now is that the caption has moved from newsprint to mimeo paper. The point being that not only is America now seeing Black heroes on a daily basis, but they are getting a glimpse into their lives as husbands and fathers and members of the community at large. Remember, there was no social media like today, no Instagram, no Twitter, no TikTok, pretty much only the print media. Now to the 1960s. The headline of one of these press photos of an event in New York, Police Battle Negroes in New York's Harlem. During the 1960s, there were three major assassinations, rioting in one city after another, and countless violent episodes involving Black citizens and police. The country had become a pressure cooker that was simply boiling over with pent-up rage. But the 1960s were also a period that saw civil rights demonstrations, marches, sit-ins, and many other peaceful protests. The Greensboro Woolworth sit-in is one of the most famous and effective. As students got arrested for breaking the segregation laws of sitting at whites-only counter and refused to leave, new students replaced them. That lunch counter now resides as an exhibit in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington. It is that important. Nonviolent protests had reached a crescendo like never before in this country. This is the I Have a Dream speech delivered to 250,000 people from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and regarded as one of the greatest speeches ever and a turning point in the country's history. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act. This act outlawed major forms of discrimination against racial, ethnic, national, and religious minorities and women. It ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and by facilities that serve the general public. In this photo, you can see Dr. King looking over President Johnson's shoulder as the act is signed. Shifting gears back to baseball, but sticking with the 1960s decade, in 1962, Jackie Robinson, first African-American player in the major leagues, became the first African-American elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. This was an incredibly historic moment. It took another 7 years after the last major league team was desegregated for the major leagues to hire an African-American umpire. Emmett Ashford was the first in 1966. It is important to note that umpiring, like so many other jobs, required schooling. And when schools, trade centers, colleges, and universities were segregated, so many African Americans simply could not get the training or education that they needed to fulfill working roles in society. This contributed to a timeline for many Blacks entering the workforce with whites. In 1967, Hank Aaron, who was in the middle of a more than 20-year run of hitting more home runs than any other major league player, signed a contract for 2 years at $100,000 a year, the biggest single contract ever signed by a major league player, black or white. Another momentous occasion. And then a year later, Bonnie Irvin, great New York Giant, became a baseball executive as assistant director of promotion and public relations in the baseball commissioner's office, and as such was officially the first black baseball executive. Another momentous occasion. Great photo of amazing athletes. Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, Don Newcomb, Luke Easter, Roy Campanella, all giants in the field. And the two quotes tell a huge story, so I'm going to read them. First, from Dr. Martin Luther King to Don Newcomb, the middle player of the Brooklyn Dodgers. You'll never know how easy you and Jackie and Doby and Campy, parenthetically, all in this photo, made it for me to do my job by what you did on the baseball field. And years later, Don Newcomb commented, imagine, here is Martin getting beaten with billy clubs, bitten by dogs, and thrown in jail, and he says we made his job easier. Now I'm going to jump back to society at large in the 1960s. This collage represents a small but representative group of African Americans who pioneered positions that were never held by African Americans. First black student at the University of Mississippi who had to be escorted through the front door by U.S. Marshals. First black woman to be a U.S. ambassador. First black astronaut. First African American to hold a cabinet post. First black conductor for a major orchestra. First black students to integrate white Nashville schools. First consecrated black archbishop in the U.S. First black mayor of a major U.S. city. First black attorney general. First black officer to command a U.S. warship. The 1960s was the decade when the walls came tumbling down. I need to give Shirley Chisholm a page of her own. First African-American woman to sit in the House of Representatives, 1968. A few years later, the first African-American woman to run for president, the first African-American to run for president with a major party and with the best presidential slogan ever, unbought and unbossed. And her quote here, I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman and equally proud of that. I am the candidate of the people, and my presence before you symbolizes a new era in American political history. And I need to give the great Thurgood Marshall a slide of his own as well, the first African-American on the Supreme Court, 1967. In a way, this slide represents the most important group of African Americans in the 1960s. Everyday people who were thrust into pioneering, trailblazing roles. On the left is, and I quote, Miss Amalia Kearse, who will become the first Negro lawyer for the New York firm of Hughes, Hubbard, Blair, and Reed. This young Black woman graduate of the University of Michigan Law School is about to go to an all-white, probably almost all-male Wall Street firm. And on the right, and I quote, two 20-year-old Negroes will try to register at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa on Tuesday. Governor George Wallace said he will personally bar the two from registering at the university. Okay, how crazy is this? Everyone in the state pays taxes to support the state schools, but only half the people paying the taxes can go to those schools, and the governor himself is going to personally block the door so two young people cannot enter. Not only all the future generations of Black Americans, but the future generations of all Americans owe these three people and the millions like them a huge debt of thanks. On to the 1970s, further change. Racism is so universal in this country, so widespread and deep-seated, that it is invisible because it is so normal. And I have nothing to lose by standing up for my beliefs. So I'll go to jail. So what? We've been in jail for 400 years. On September 1st, 1971, this group of ball players stepped onto the field. By the way, a couple of these guys are some of the greatest players who ever lived and are in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Let me read you the quote by Al Oliver, the first baseman, talking to Dave Cash, the second baseman and a rookie. The two were walking back onto the field after batting. Probably in the third or fourth inning is when I noticed it. And I asked Dave Cash, I said, Dave, we have all brothers out there. And he said, oh, yes, we do. This was the first all black and brown lineup in the history of Major League Baseball. Two quick notes. One of my childhood heroes, Roberto Clemente, upper right in the grid, finished the next season after his hitting a legendary lifetime goal of 3,000 hits, 3,000 hits on the nose. He still had years left in him to play, but he was involved in charity work in Latin America and Caribbean countries during the off seasons. He often delivered equipment and food to those in need personally. Who does this today? Nobody. In 1972, a year after the date on this slide, he died in a plane crash at the age of 38 while en route to deliver aid to victims of the Nicaragua earthquake. Baseball changed its rules for Hall of Fame admission to elect him immediately. I don't know of another athlete today who is even fractionally involved in charity work the way Clemente was. And in the lower right-hand corner is Doc Ellis, the only pitcher on record to throw a no-hitter while tripping on LSD. He pitched wildly all day long in a game against the San Diego Padres, walking 8 and hitting one batter, but no one could hit his pitches. He had pitched a no-hitter high on acid. No kidding. Look it up. As Hank Aaron was chasing Babe Ruth's home run record in 1974, he received daily hate mail and death threats. A black man was about to replace a white man as the greatest home run hitter ever. Two quotes from Hank Aaron. First, if I was white, all America would be proud of me, but I'm black. Second, we have moved in the right direction. There have been improvements. We still have a long way to go in this country. The bigger difference is that back then they had hoods. Now they have neckties and starched shirts. Yeah, really. Frank Robinson becoming the first black manager in 1975 was a huge event. Robinson was a phenomenal player and won what is called the Triple Crown in 1966. The Triple Crown consists of leading the league in 3 different categories: batting average, home runs, and runs batted in. Since Robinson did this in 1966, only 2 other players have done this in over a half century. He was an amazing athlete and a very smart tactician. I need to point out what I think is the most important thing about this press photo. I bolded the title above for a reason. In the caption of the press photo, Robinson is referred to as baseball's first black manager, not baseball's first Negro manager, like every other press photo I have showed you up to this point. In the 1960s and 1970s, a sea change came to America with a huge groundswell of black pride and finally an embracing of black culture as an incredibly important part of American culture. In common discourse, the term Negro was pushed aside and substituted with African American and Black, reflecting this change. The entire movement has changed the lives of everyone since. On April 6, 1987, I was watching Nightline, a long-running nightly news show. The Nightline actor Ted Koppel interviewed Al Campanis, then the general manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers and a one-time teammate of Jackie Robinson, the African-American baseball player who broke the major league color barrier. During the interview, Koppel asked Campanis why African-American managers and general managers were virtually non-existent in the sport. Campanis gave the following response, and I quote, "It's just that they may not have some of the necessities to be, let's say, a field manager or perhaps a general manager." I remember sitting there in utter disbelief. Koppel gave him every opportunity to walk it back, but Campanis kept digging a deeper hole. He was fired immediately. For me, this was a huge wake-up call. Desegregating America is still a constant and ongoing struggle, and there is a long way to go. But I'm ending on a high note, and I'm going to read the entire quote above by the baseball commissioner, Bud Selig. Throughout its long history, Major League Baseball has operated under the premise that no single person is bigger than the game, no single person other than Jackie Robinson. In his life and in the remarkable legacy he left to all Americans, Jackie Robinson was and remains bigger than the game. Jackie's entry in Major League Baseball 50 years ago today will forever remain baseball's proudest moment. In honor of Jackie, Major League Baseball is taking the unprecedented step to retire Jackie's uniform, number 42, in perpetuity. The number 42 from this day forward will never be issued by a major league club. This is a quick epilogue. A couple weeks ago, something happened that I never thought possible. On May 28th, Major League Baseball combined the player statistics of Major League Baseball, which was essentially all the white players pre-1947, with Negro League statistics, including all the black players pre-1947. We now finally have an accurate record of baseball player statistics, not separated by race. This is a huge, huge deal. By the way, this is Josh Gibson sliding. Remember him from earlier in the presentation? As of a couple weeks ago, Babe Ruth statistically is no longer considered by Major League Baseball to be the greatest hitter ever. Josh Gibson is now the leader for both single season and full career in most of the top hitting statistics. Finally, he will be given the credit and respect due 3/4 of a century after his death. As Nelson Mandela said, it is never too late to do the right thing. And finally, rest in peace, Willie Mays, who just passed away a day before Juneteenth, a couple days ago. I am guessing that most of you who are younger do not know him, but many who know him believe he may have been the greatest all-around ball player of all time, and was a role model hero to millions and millions of children, black and white, over decades. R.I.P. Willie. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.